Welcome back to Scotty's Hobbies. Today I'm working on this 2014 Toyota Corolla. I'm going to be replacing the front brake pads and rotors and giving you the torque specifications, just showing you how to do a complete proper brake job on this vehicle. Now this video will be the same for all the 2009 to 2019 Toyota Corollas, but the torque specifications will be the same for I believe 2002 all the way up to 2019. So there'll be a video coming on that very soon. Throughout this video, I'm going to show you all the tools you need, the torque specifications and the parts, and including what lube to use and where to use it. So we're going to be using brake grease, which I'm going to show you some spots where you can use it if you want and you don't have to, and where to use your anti-seize. Before we get too far into this video, please hit that like button, subscribe, share, check out the video library for a ton of automotive helpful DIY videos. Now, let's get into this one. You can see here, we're working on the passenger side. I have the wheel turned to the passenger side so the caliper is facing outward. It makes it a lot easier to work on. We're going to take a look at everything, make sure there's no moist spots on the accordion boots, make sure that the CV shaft is good, just make sure we don't need to do anything else while we are here. Also, while you do this brake job, if you follow my procedure, you do not need to bleed the brakes when we're all said and done to get this job done right. It's a complete easy, you're not opening the brake fluid system, it makes it really easy. And after you watch this video, it should take you about an hour to an hour and a half to get this job done. I'm going to show you all the tools you need, where you're going to put grease, everything you need to know is going to be in this video. First, we're going to compress the piston back into the caliper. But before we do that, we need to go up to the brake fluid reservoir and remove the cap off of the reservoir. Just in case there's so much fluid in the system that it's going to need to overflow, you don't blow any seals or rings, it just lets it escape out of the reservoir. You might need to clean up the floor and the reservoir area when you're done if it overflows. Now, we're going to get a flathead screwdriver or a pry bar, and we're going to pry on the rotor and put pressure onto the caliper. So we're going to stick that flathead screwdriver in the rotor and pry outwards. And that's going to push the piston into the caliper itself. Make sure you push the piston all the way in, so you don't need to press it the rest of the way in like I have to show you in this video. I didn't push it all the way in, and you'll see that later on in the video. So if you don't want to do it this way, I'm going to show you the other way to do it later on. But this makes it a lot easier for you and requires one less tool to get the job done if you don't have the caliper compressor. Now that you have the piston pushed all the way back into the caliper, we can go ahead and remove the caliper from the bracket. Now this is going to be a 14mm socket that you're going to use to remove these bolts from the piston to the bracket. From the caliper to the bracket. Real easy. And if you have a 3/8 socket wrench, that will make it real easy to come off. These ones aren't torqued down too tight. And just take it off. If you have a 1/2" socket wrench and socket set, you could just use that one socket set, but you are going to be torquing everything down. So a 3/8 torque wrench and a 1/2" torque wrench might be required if you're actually going to follow the torque specifications that I show you in this video. With both of the caliper to bracket bolts out, we're going to remove the caliper off of the brake pads, off of the rotor, and instead of letting it hang from the brake line hose itself, we are going to hang the caliper up on the strut assembly on the spring up there, and just make sure it's held up there. I don't like to let it hang on that brake hose. I know some people out there do, and I have seen videos that show that really you could put a ton of pressure on these lines before they break. So whatever you do, I prefer not to let the caliper hang on the brake hose. So that's what I would do if I were you. Now that we have the brake caliper up there on the strut and spring assembly, it's just sitting up there nice and tight. Well, it's not tight, but it's not going to fall off. We can go ahead and remove the brake pads from the brake caliper bracket itself. Just take a look at these, make sure you're not metal to metal if you're going to be reusing your rotor or get the rotor machined. In this case, we're replacing everything, the brake pads, the hardware kit, and the rotor. So take everything out, set it off to the side. After you get these brake pads out, we could go ahead and remove the brake caliper bracket to knuckle. These two bolts are 17mm, so I'm using a 1/2" 17mm on my impact. You could use a 1/2" socket wrench or a breaker bar to remove these bolts, and it should be fairly easy. These really, none of the torque specs on this vehicle are super tight. I believe these ones are right around 80 pounds. And again, we're going to be going over everything torque specification wise when we get to that part of the assembly process later in the video. Now that we have the bracket to knuckle bolts out, we could go ahead and remove the bracket, set that off to the side, and remove the rotor. This one was really easy. It wasn't seized to the hub, which just makes it a lot easier and faster to get off. If you do have a rotor that's stuck onto the hub, you might whack it with a really heavy purse or a rubber mallet, and it should pop right off. With the rotor off of the hub, we could go ahead and now clean the hub. You want to make sure that this surface is nice and clean so the rotor has a nice, even, flat mounting surface to be mounted to. You don't want to have any high spots or low spots, so you have a nice flat surface. You don't get any pulsation in the brake pedal when you're applying the brakes, and also just make sure everything lasts a little bit longer than if you didn't clean this off. After it's all cleaned off, we're going to go ahead and use some anti-seize and put it on the hub. That makes it so that next time you do a brake job, if you need to, you can easily remove the rotor and it's not seized or stuck onto the hub assembly right there itself. Grab your new rotor. Before you install the new rotor, make sure you clean off both sides of the rotor using some brake clean. I missed that while shooting the video, but you can see I have a brake clean over there on the far side of the video, and I made sure that both sides of the rotor has no surface or no oil or grime left on the surface of the rotor when I installed it. I also like to use one lug nut to hold the rotor in place while I am assembling everything. Just makes it way easier so the rotor's not flopping around when you're trying to install the caliper bracket and the brake pads, all that stuff. So it holds the rotor in place. Just a little quick tip for you right there. Before we put the caliper bracket back onto this vehicle, we're going to take it off to the side, clean everything off, and install a new hardware kit. When you buy brake pads, if you use the link in the description that I provide for you guys, those brake pads include a kit that has the hardware in it. So always replace the hardware when you're doing brakes. I highly, highly recommend it. If you're trying to pinch some pennies, you can get a little bit of cheaper set that doesn't have the hardware kit, but I always recommend replacing the hardware kit while you're here. Just makes it a much better BJ than not doing so. Let's grab the brake caliper bracket. We want to make sure that the slider pins easily move in and out of the caliper bracket. If they don't, you're going to take a little bit more time cleaning these caliper sliders out and also the holes that they slide in inside that caliper bracket. In this case, it was really easy. They didn't slide, or they didn't have any problem sliding in and out. So all I had to do was clean these sliders off, lube them up, and put them back in. So it was real easy. Nothing too hard about this one, which I really, really like. And you might run into the problem to where it is seized or that slider pin is seized in there. And in that case, you will need to clean those cylinders out or the bores inside the caliper bracket out using like a pipe cleaner, something like that. I use a pipe cleaner, some WD-40, blow it out with air, and then re-lube it up before I install everything. So just make sure that your brake caliper sliders are really, really freely sliding. If these are not sliding properly, you will get uneven brake pad wear, uneven brakes applying onto, or brake pads applying onto the rotor, and just it's not a good brake job, and you get poor braking out of that. So just make sure your slider pins are freely sliding in and out of that brake caliper bracket. When you're lubing these up, you don't need to use too much lube. A little bit goes a long way on your slider pins. Just a nice little thin layer of grease on the slider pins goes a long way when you're doing this. With the slider pins lubed up and reinstalled, I like to make sure that the mating surface on the caliper bracket that is going to be going up to the knuckle is nice and cleaned off too. It would be a good idea to clean off the knuckle side surface as well. That is one thing I did not do in this video, but I do like to do that most of the time. I don't know why I'm missing this. I was probably distracted by talking to the customer and trying to make this video at the same time. But make sure everything where metal to metal is mating up with each other is nice and a clean, flat surface. I'm using the hub cleaning kit to clean off the brake caliper bracket and just not putting too much grease or elbow grease into this, just making sure it's nice and clean. Next, we're going to remove the old hardware kit where the ears of the pads meet up with the caliper bracket. We always use a new hardware kit in this case, or when you're doing a brake job. So make sure, again, you get a hardware kit to replace the old one with. With the hardware kit removed, we're going to clean up the bracket where the ears meet into the bracket using a wire brush, or if you have a wire wheel, that would suffice just fine. But just make sure the bracket is nice and clean. You don't want any brake dust or road grime in this area. So when you put the new hardware kit in there, it has a nice flat surface to meet on as well. You don't have any high spots for the brake pads to get stuck on. When you press on the brake, they'll actually come off of the brake rotor. I like to use a little bit of anti-seize in the channels of the brake caliper bracket. That makes it so that the hardware kit does not get stuck inside this bracket. So again, makes it a little bit easier to do the brake job next time. And just a little bit of a dab. You don't need much anti-seize at all. With that anti-seize in there, we're going to grab the new hardware kit. Make sure these are installed in the right fashion. If you install them backwards, you're going to get a hardware kit or one of these silencer shims rubbing on the rotor, and obviously will not be silent. So just make sure you're putting these in the right way and they're not rubbing on the rotor. These brake pads have the wear indicator separate from the actual brake pad, so you could install it on any side of the pad that you need to or want to when you are installing these brake pads. Makes it a little bit easier, but sometimes confuses people. And you really want the wear indicator to be on the leading edge of the brake pad. So on this case, the leading edge is the top side of the brake pad. I will also put a little tiny bit of grease on the hardware kit, not much at all, just a little bit. And the manufacturer recommends putting grease in this location. There is a big hoopla online. You'll find a lot of people don't like to put brake grease on the hardware kit, on the actual brake caliper bracket. And the argument is that you will be causing brake dust and road grime to build up on there and makes the brake pad not freely slide in and out. But manufacturer recommends it, so I do it. And I got a little bit of grease on this rotor, so you can see I got that brake clean and I sprayed it on there, got it nice and cleaned off. You want this surface to be nice and clean. You don't want any grease on there, oil, anything like that on that rotor before you install the new brake pads, and just make sure this job is done properly. So make sure you keep the rotor surface nice and clean. Now the caliper bracket is ready to be installed over the rotor and onto the knuckle. Make sure you don't get any grease on that rotor so you don't have to clean it off again. Grab these 17mm bolts, tighten them up. Don't go tight, really. Use your fingers, finger tighten it. I'm going to use my impact gun to tighten them up to 1 click on the low setting so it doesn't over torque them. And then we're going to use a 1/2-inch torque wrench and torque these 17mm bolts down to 79 foot-pounds. Again, these 17mm bolts are tightened down to 79 foot-pounds. That is according to the Motor Guide book for brake specifications guide, and it hasn't done me wrong yet. So 79 foot-pounds, 17mm bolts, first click on your torque wrench, and you are good to go. With the bracket properly tightened down to the torque specifications, we could go ahead and install the brake pads. Again, the brake pads are installed with the wear indicator on the top side of these pads. That is the leading edge of these brake pads when it comes to the surface area hitting the rotor. So wear indicators, top side of these brake pads, and there's a wear indicator on the inside and outside pad on these. I will apply a little bit of grease to the back side of the pad where the piston is going to be meeting the pad, and also on the outside pad where the caliper is going to be meeting the back side of the pad. Never put grease on the pad surface itself. If you accidentally get some on there, make sure you use some brake clean or something like that and clean that off of there before you get going down the road, because you're going to run into a little bit of braking problems if you do that. With the brake pads installed into the caliper bracket, we can go ahead and get the caliper up from the spring or that strut assembly and get ready to install it over these brake pads. Remember earlier in the video when I mentioned I didn't get the piston pressed all the way into the caliper? Well, this is where I figured that out. I tried to slide the caliper over the brake pads and noticed it wasn't easily sliding over them. I looked and I noticed the piston wasn't pushed all the way back into the caliper. So here is another way that you can compress the piston back into the caliper. If you have a caliper compression tool, or if you look in the description, you can buy one of these. They're fairly cheap, less than 20 bucks. And if you're doing a lot of brake jobs, this is the better way to do it, in my opinion. Grab an old brake pad, put it up against the piston, put the brake caliper compression tool inside the caliper, and push that brake pad as far as you can onto the caliper itself. So the piston's completely depressed inside of that caliper. You can't push this in too far if you do it this way. I don't think you could push the piston in too far anyway, so don't be afraid of doing that. Once the piston is pushed all the way back into the caliper, I'm going to slide the caliper over the brake pads to where there's no friction, there's nothing holding it up from sliding easily over the brake pads, and I'm going to grab the 14mm bolts and tighten these up finger tight. So the 14mm bolts are going to hold the caliper onto the bracket, tighten these up finger tight, and then we're going to torque these down to 25 foot-pounds. Again, the 14mm bolts that go from the caliper to the bracket, these are torqued down to 25 foot-pounds. Fairly not tight at all. 25 foot-pounds is really easy to strip these out, so it's really important to use proper torque specifications when you are doing a brake job. You don't want the bolts to rattle loose, you don't want to strip anything out, and it's just a good practice to use when you're doing a brake job. I personally do it on 99% of the brake jobs I perform myself. With everything tightened down, I'm going to go over to the driver's seat and press on the brake pedal 3 to 5 times. Make sure I get a nice, firm, stiff pedal. And I'm going to turn the wheel straight so it's easier to put the wheel back on. After you get the nice, firm pedal, go back over and make sure you don't have any leaks, you don't see any moisture on the brake caliper itself. And then go double check the brake fluid reservoir. If the fluid reservoir is at the max line, go ahead and just put the cap on it and you're good to go. If you need to, top it off at this time, but make sure you have enough brake fluid in there. And that's pretty much it. This job takes you about 30 to 45 minutes per side. You have all the tools you need. If you have any questions, please comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and I will see you guys on the next, hopefully helpful video.